They thought they could steal his land and silence his history. A black man watched as an entire neighborhood rose on the soil his family had owned for generations. 35 gleaming homes built where his roots once ran deep. No one asked permission. No one cared. But what the developers and their powerful HOA didn't know was that the land itself held a secret, and so did he. When his patience finally broke, he opened something far greater than a legal battle. What followed would wash away more than just houses. The question is, was it justice or revenge? For most of his life, Elijah Brooks lived quietly, tucked away on the edge of a small southern town. His land wasn't just dirt and trees, it was legacy. Passed down from his great-grandfather, who had once toiled as a sharecropper before finally buying the very ground he once worked. The property stretched 4 acres, dotted with towering pines, fertile soil, and, most importantly, a reservoir he had carefully managed for decades. It was a place of history, of pride, and of survival in a world that had rarely given his family an easy chance. Elijah wasn't a wealthy man, but he was content. He farmed part of the land, leased small plots to local neighbors, and spent countless hours maintaining the dam that held back a wide stretch of water. To him, it was more than just a reservoir, it was protection. A living reminder of how his family had carved stability out of hardship. Each generation had added something to the land, and Elijah took pride in preserving it. He was the kind of man the community knew, soft-spoken, steady, with a reputation for hard work and quiet dignity. Those who respected him saw him as a cornerstone, a man who carried history with humility. But there were others, especially newcomers, who looked at his land differently. They didn't see the blood and memory woven into every acre. They saw opportunity. The town was changing. Developers had begun eyeing the outskirts, buying up tracts of land to build rows of neat, uniform houses for middle-class families looking to escape the city. They spoke of progress, growth, and modern living. But progress had a price. And too often, it was people like Elijah who paid it, at first. It was just whisper surveys being done nearby, trucks coming in and out of the woods, bright orange markers tied around trees. Elijah noticed them, but he brushed it off. His property lines were clear. Deeds were intact. His reservoir was registered. This was his home. No one could just take it. At least, that's what he thought. But slowly, the signs grew harder to ignore. Bulldozers rumbled at the edge of his land. Fences appeared where none had been before. Then, one morning, Elijah woke to the sound of hammers echoing through the valley. When he drove down the dirt road that cut across his property, his stomach turned. Dozens of foundations had already been poured, framing out what would soon become an entire neighborhood, 35 homes, all rising from the soil his family had owned for generations. He stood there, gripping the steering wheel, stunned. No paperwork, no notice, no court hearing. Houses climbing higher, each day while strangers smiled and waved as though nothing was wrong. It was as if he had been erased, his history bulldozed under concrete and shingles. Neighbors tried to reassure him, telling him to get a lawyer or fight it in court. But Elijah knew better. He'd seen it before. He knew the long, exhausting battle that came when a black man tried to stand against powerful developers, against an HOA backed by money, influence, and politics. His voice would be drowned out, his history dismissed, his ownership questioned until it was stripped away piece by piece. Still, Elijah wasn't a man who acted out of impulse. He held his silence, tending to his dam, keeping his land in order, waiting, watching. He let the developers keep building, let the families move in, let the HOA stake their claim. All the while, he knew something they didn't. The entire neighborhood sat downstream of the reservoir, a body of water controlled by the dam he had maintained his whole life. The question wasn't whether Elijah had power. The question was how long he could keep it contained. At first, Elijah told himself it was just a mistake, some zoning error, some paperwork shuffled in the wrong drawer. But as weeks turned into months, the mistake only grew. Streets were paved. Across his land, streetlights installed, playgrounds hammered together. The hum of saws and the crack of hammers never stopped. Where his grandfather's crops once stood, now stood polished signs boasting, "Welcome to Willow Creek Estates, a premier HOA community." It was a cruel sight. Elijah's family name had been tied to that soil for generations, yet not a single trace of it was acknowledged. No one knocked on his door. No one asked his permission. Instead, homeowners drove in with moving trucks, waving at each other like they were pioneers settling untouched ground. To them, this was fresh land. To Elijah, it was theft in broad daylight. But the insult didn't stop there. Soon came the HOA letter's formal notices with his name misspelled, claiming he was in violation of community regulations. They told him his fencing was not up to standard. They threatened fines for unkempt property. He even demanded he drain his reservoir, calling it a safety hazard for the families now living downstream. It was as if the invaders weren't satisfied with stealing his land. They wanted to erase his presence entirely. Elijah knew what this was. He'd seen it before in smaller ways. The suspicious glances at stores, but Times officials misplaced his paperwork. The subtle reminders that his blackness was reason enough to be doubted. But this wasn't subtle. This was blatant. 35 homes, all built on the backs of power, privilege, and the assumption that his voice would never matter. The more he resisted, the heavier the pressure became. HOA board members showed up at his gate in pressed shirts and polished shoes, smiling as they spoke down to him like a child. They promised compensation if he signed his rights away, a fraction of the land's worth. When he refused, the smiles dropped. The threats began. "We'll take it to court. You'll lose everything. Best not to fight what's already decided." Elijah didn't shout. He didn't argue. But inside, a fire was building. He remembered his grandfather's stories of how the land had been won through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. He remembered his father's warnings about how quickly it could all be stolen again. Now, living proof stood before him. Families sipping lemonade on porches built on stolen soil. Children laughing on playgrounds where his crops once grew. And the worst part? They looked at him like he didn't belong, like he was the intruder one. Evening, as Elijah drove past the neighborhood, he slowed at the sight of a community watch sign. Just below it, 2 men in lawn chairs sat with folded arms staring at his truck as he passed. No words, no greetings. Just eyes that told him he wasn't welcome on his own land. That night, he lay awake listening to the hum of crickets and the faint rush of water against the dam. He thought about every legal battle his family had fought just to keep what was theirs. He thought about every smile turned into a sneer the moment they realized his skin color. He thought about every injustice, swallowed because fighting back meant risking everything. But this time was different. He wasn't powerless. Not here, because while the HOA controlled their bylaws, while the developers controlled their blueprints, Elijah controlled the one thing none of them could touch: the dam. A wall of concrete and steel holding back millions of gallons of water, perched directly above the shiny new streets of Willow Creek Estates. Every time he stood on that dam looking down at the houses below, the tension grew. The reservoir was a silent witness to his rage, a sleeping giant waiting for his command. The homeowners laughed and watered their lawns, unaware that their picture-perfect community sat on borrowed time. Elijah had been patient his whole life. Patient when he was disrespected. Patient when he was ignored. Patient when his history was stolen. But patience has limits, and soon the water would have none. The storm came without warning. Dark clouds rolled in across the valley, winds bending. Trees as thunder cracked in the distance. The homeowners of Willow Creek hurried inside, pulling lawn chairs and toys off their manicured yards. They worried about wet driveways, about shingles rattling in the wind. But for Elijah, the storm wasn't just weather, it was a mirror of everything he had carried inside for years. He stood on the dam, rain pelting his skin, staring down at the rows of new homes below. Every roof, every streetlight, every mailbox was a reminder of how his family's legacy had been stolen, paved over, and sold to people who looked at him like a trespasser. And then, as if fate itself wanted to force the moment, the HOA trucks arrived. 3 of them. Men in press jackets and polished shoes climbed out, holding clipboards under umbrellas. They marched right up to Elijah's property, shouting over the storm, "Mr. Brooks, this reservoir is a hazard. We've filed with the county. Phew! Don't drain it immediately. We'll force the order through. You'll be liable for damages. Liable for damages." The word hit Elijah like a slap. 4 generations, his family had been denied, cheated, and erased. Now, after stealing his land, after building 35 homes on soil they didn't own, they had the audacity to threaten him. The storm surged louder, the water below churning violently, as though the earth itself was tired of swallowing injustice. Elijah's heart pounded. He saw flashes of his grandfather's hands, scarred from work, yet steady as they signed the deed to this land. He heard his father's voice reminding him to hold on to it no matter what. And now here he was, standing against polished men who didn't care about history. Only profit. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the faces of the board members. They weren't pleading. They weren't negotiating. They were demanding, as if Elijah had no choice. No power, no voice. And in that moment he realized something chilling. They had never feared him. They never thought he could do anything to stop them. But they had forgotten the damn dot. The rain intensified. The reservoir swelling higher, the gates groaning under the pressure. Elijah walked slowly to the controls, every step echoing the generations. Behind him, the men shouted, their voices sharp with panic now. "Don't touch that. You'll regret it. We'll ruin you in court." Court paper. Words, all the tools they had always used to strip men like him of what they owned. But the water didn't answer to courts. The dam didn't care about paperwork. For the first time in his life, Elijah felt control, raw, undeniable control. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of the decision pressing down on him. The storm roared, the reservoir surged, and the voices of the HOA men turned to frantic yells. He gripped the lever. He thought of the laughter of children playing on land that wasn't theirs to claim. He thought of the smirks of board members telling him his history meant nothing. He thought of every moment he had been told to wait, to be patient, to fight the right way. And then, with a force that shook his entire body, he pulled, the gates screamed open, and the water exploded forward like a beast unleashed. A wall of churning, unstoppable currents surged through the valley, ripping across streets, sweeping away lawns, swallowing the houses that had risen on stolen ground. Lights flickered and died. Alarms wailed. Voices turned to screams. Elijah stood frozen, rain mixing with tears, watching as everything they had built on his land was consumed. This wasn't just destruction, it was history rising, rage unchained. It's the weight of centuries crashing down in a flood no one could stop. For once, the power wasn't in their hands. It was in his dot. And as the valley disappeared beneath the torrent, one question echoed louder than the storm itself. Was this justice, or something far darker? When the floodwaters finally receded, Willow Creek Estates was no longer the pristine picture of suburban progress it had once been. The streets were buried in mud, homes stood gutted and broken, and the carefully curated lawns lay twisted beneath debris. What had been built on arrogance and stolen history was now a wasteland. But Elijah did not stand victorious. He stood hollow, staring at what he had unleashed. For generations, his family had endured loss, humiliation, and erasure, yet never had they struck back in this way. The weight of what he had done pressed down on him. Yes, he had power. Yes, he had reminded them that the land was never theirs to take. But as he looked over the wreckage, he felt something deeper. Grief. Grief that it had come to this. Grief that justice had never been an option unless it wore the mask of destruction. In the days that followed, the story spread like wildfire. News crews descended, cameras framing Elijah not as a man wronged, but as a dangerous villain. Headlines. Read, Black landowner destroys subdivision. Commentators debated whether he was a criminal or a radical. Few asked why 35 homes were allowed to be built on land that was never legally relinquished. Fewer still asked why his warnings. His rights, his very existence, had been ignored until the flood forced them to see him. This is the pattern of history. A black man silenced until his anger becomes impossible to ignore, then defined not by the injustice he endured, but by the reaction born of it. Elijah became another symbol in a long, painful chain. Denied agency, denied justice, denied humanity. Until the story could no longer be contained, and yet behind the sensational headlines, there were whispers. People who saw not just the flood, but the truth beneath it. People who asked how 35 homes could be erected on a man's ancestral land without his consent. People who saw how the HOA letters, the threats, the surveillance were not isolated incidents, but echoes of a system that had always told Black Americans they did not belong. Even when the land was theirs, Elijah's flood was more than water. It was a revelation. It forced a town to see what it had tried to ignore. It forced a country to confront the question it keeps burying. How many times can you erase a people's history before the ground itself rises in protest? And that's the truth that lingers long after the storm clears. Elijah's story is not just about one man and one neighborhood. It is about centuries of dispossession, about Black families whose land was stolen through intimidation, fraud, or legal loopholes. It is about the way power defines justice and how silence is demanded until rage explodes. For some, Elijah was a criminal. For others, he was a warning. But for anyone willing to look deeper, his story was a mirror. A mirror showing that racism is not always burning crosses or shouted slurs. It is paperwork misplaced, ownership questioned, history erased, and dignity stripped away piece by piece until nothing remains. The flood at Willow Creek is over. The waters dried, the houses rebuilt, the headlines faded. But the question remains, how many more Elijahs will it take? How many more stolen legacies must be buried under progress before this country stops pretending that injustice is an accident? Because the truth is simple. You can dam water, you can bury history, you can silence a man's voice. But eventually, inevitably, what has been suppressed will rise. And when it does, the world has to choose. Will we call it destruction, or will we finally call it justice? If this story moved you, don't stay silent, share it. Leave your thoughts in the comments and let the world know these stories cannot be ignored.